all of the world's Nazi organizations, even the ones that are in Ukraine and in Russia, they hate homosexuals. Next, I need to tell you guys about a real issue, a significantly important issue today, something that was exposed to me by our favorite Russian state TV propagandist, Salinov. I never pronounced his name correctly. He has exposed something to me and to you that we had no clue about until he brought it to our attention. And that is not only about the Nazi menace in Ukraine, which of course we have talked about here on the show, on how it's overplayed and Russia is not engaged in a denazification operation. They don't care about denazification. If they did, they wouldn't have the Wagner group led by a neo-Nazi and founded by a neo-Nazi, and they wouldn't have Rusich fighting for them and other known neo-Nazis fighting for the Russian army. They also don't really care about denazification. Whatever, right? Whatever. But there's a new element that he tries to hit on here. He says that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not an invasion, it's a counterattack. A counterattack launched in response to 8 years of Ukrainian genocide against those who won't accept LGBT, transgender, Nazi values. A genocide against those who won't accept LGBT, transgender, Nazi values. Absolutely bizarre. Let's play it. Let's listen to it. Let's hear about these values that apparently were being pushed on the people of the Donbass without their knowledge, being forced by the barrel of a gun by a boy-modded Heydrich Himmler. Let's listen. Everyone always knows that the biggest threat the Jewish community faces today is boy-modding, apparently. Let's listen to what he has to say. Of course, what is happening is incredible. Let's turn it down so I can read the subs. Those falsehoods, that absolute perversion, those lies in every sound. When Zelensky's Nazis suddenly say, "What are you doing?" When they tell us that we need to be eliminated simply because we're a country of traditional values, the war gains an entirely different meaning. Any lie against us are good. And what's interesting is that the Mail Online hasn't come up with anything new. All the very same lies, as if copied exactly, having been written from the time of any wars waged by the West against Russia. Our problem is that we just can't explain to people who started this war. Even this operation, when it started, was us starting a counterattack on February 24th. Okay, so to be clear, the reason he's trying to say it's a counterattack, it's because of this narrative the Kremlin has pushed during this war. And it's to try to take off the heat from them because they very obviously invaded Ukraine. Anybody with 2 brain cells can say that. So here's the narrative, is that, oh, February 24th, that wasn't an invasion, it was a counterattack, because in the last 8 years, Ukraine was bombing Russian speakers in the Donbass, and we were finally just too fed up, and we came in a humanitarian mission to liberate them. Okay, so there's 2 problems with this. The first problem is that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea illegally at the point of a gun. Igor Girkin talks extensively about how politicians in Crimea were held up at gunpoint and forced to dissolve the government, and then they had a fraudulent referendum that was that they didn't really even care about doing it legitimately. It was fraught with voter fraud. Then there was like local Tatar activists were killed, thrown in rivers. It was a brutal annexation. But then when it comes to like Luhansk and Donetsk, the Donbass, the Russians funneled weapons, funneled armored vehicles, and funneled agents into the Donbass, which is 90% led by Russian citizens. FSB agent Igor Girkin, the former defense minister for the Donetsk People's Republic, he is an FSB agent. He fired down and shot down a civilian airliner. He's a war criminal. They have been fomenting rebellion in the Donbass and funneling weapons into it and trying to split up the Ukrainian country. That is part of Russia's invasion in 2014. And so that 8 years of shelling was because the Russians were invading Ukraine. If you invade, the people are going to fire at you and attack you for invading them. That's just naturally how war comes and goes. And they talk about that as if the Russians also didn't kill a tremendously large amount of people in the Donbass. They talk about 13,000 people. The Ukraine genocided 13,000 people in the Donbass. I even had this debate with the Yankee Tanky, and that was the number we were arguing. That 13,000 number that the Russians bring up and Solonyov has brought up on many occasions is just the total amount of casualties in fighting. Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian military casualties, and the rebels and Russian military casualties. That isn't a genocide, that's just combat. And all of the civilians who are dying are Ukrainian civilians, because it's all within Ukraine. Not to mention, the amount of civilians, specifically Russian speakers, that are dying in the Donbass is horrific. But it was nothing, but that problem wasn't resolved by the war expanding. In fact, more Russian speakers have died because of the Russian invasion than Ukraine could have ever killed through continued fighting in the Donbass or from Russia's continued killing of Russian speakers in the Donbass. More Russian speakers are dying now due to the Russian bombardment than ever before in modern history. And so the idea that this was a counterattack when the Russians invaded in 2014, and the Russians are the ones bombing and killing Russian speakers mostly, they're the ones that's killing the most Russian speakers and people in Ukraine, Ukrainian civilians. It's quite silly. And I hate I have to argue against this, because this is just like, this is Russian state TV. This is the most flagrant of propaganda. But I did want to address that before he moved forward to talk about the transgender Nazis. Because it's generally one stage of an 8-year-long escalation of the Ukrainian Banderite Nazi authorities' genocide against the Russian people, against Russian speakers, against those who don't accept LGBT transgender Nazi values. By the way, how interesting is that? Nazism in its most modern incarnation, which initially aimed to eliminate Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and the mentally ill, has become absolutely entwined with ultra-liberalism and acquired the features of liberal fascism, of liberal nationalism. We're in the front ranks of fighters for nationalist ideals. Stand pederasts who deny the very essence of humanity. When he says pederast, he means pedophile. And neglect themselves. Just look at Zelensky. Even in his acting career, he of course was constantly promoting absolutely pederastic values. All his dancing in latex, all his gay mannerisms. They're saying he's saying basically the F slur for gay people when he says pederast. All that playing around with drugs. Look at his entourage. Look at how they've imposed an absolutely alien cultural code on the former Orthodox country of Ukraine. Okay, so I don't know where to start here. Nazism is inherently homophobic. Nazism is inherently anti-Semitic. Nazism is inherently anti-Roma. aka gypsy, but the word you're supposed to use is Roma. Nazism is inherently anti all of these things. You cannot have a pro-Jewish, led by a Jewish president of Ukraine, form of Nazism hell-bent on pushing transgender and gay values on Russia. This is just not a thing. All of the world's Nazi organizations, even the ones that are in Ukraine and in Russia, they hate homosexuals. Rusich hates homosexuals. Right Sector, this is a far-right Ukrainian organization that they say those are the Nazis. They hate homosexuals. They hate transgender people. Right Sector actually broke up LGBTQ plus readings, LGBTQ plus like book events, where they were trying to expand Ukrainian queer literature. They went there, attacked the participants in these events, because they do not want homosexual literature, queer literature in Ukraine, in Ukrainian, because they see it as a disgrace to Ukrainian culture. Right Sector did that. The so-called transgender gay Nazis that he's pointing to, that somehow exist no matter how many ideological inconsistencies are just inherent in the words he just said, they were the ones fighting against queer literature coming to Ukraine. I had to study this when I was making that video about homosexuality in modern Ukraine. It was right sector. This is why I don't like right sector, because they're incredibly homophobic, and their values are not values shared by Zelensky. They're not values shared by me or the rest of the so-called liberal transgender Nazi Jew agenda. Just how many negative attributes could they apply to the enemies are gay, they're Jewish, but they're also Nazis. It's ridiculous. But these contradictions don't matter to Russian state TV, because the point here isn't to have an ideologically consistent worldview. Because this guy doesn't have an ideologically consistent worldview. Anybody who thinks there's such a thing as transgender gay Nazis, led by Jews, led by the Jew Zelensky, backed by the Jew George Soros, and the globalist elite, anybody who believes that isn't somebody with ideological consistency. They're either serving like the politics of aesthetics, like the aesthetics of fascism, so they're just trying to attach all these labels to their opponents. But this is more about, to him and to Russian state TV, this is much more about just attacking. Just, they're gay, and I know here how in Russian society we hate gays. What else does Russian society hate? We're scared of trans people, so they're also trans. And also we hate Nazis because of the Great Patriotic War, so they're also Nazis. They're just trying to think of every single negative thing that you could think of somebody in Russia, and they're trying to apply it to Ukraine. Because how else are you going to convince Russians to go fight and die in this pointless, ridiculous, imperialistic war where they're trying to make Ukraine a colony for the Russian state? Which is what they're trying to do. And after losing possibly up to 90,000 soldiers in Ukraine, how are you going to convince more people to go fight and die? Especially as casualty numbers are skyrocketing right now, because all of these mobilized troops, they're going in not with proper medical equipment. They're going in with tampons instead of medical gauze. I'm not kidding you. They're being told to get tampons to apply for medical gauze. Your survivability in Ukraine depends on your class, because it depends upon whether you can go afford to buy good body armor for yourself, or you're going to have no body armor, or cheap cardboard, airsoft gear. We've seen airsoft gear on these Russian soldiers because they don't have all the equipment to properly arm their soldiers and send them into battle. This has been talked about by Solovyev. He admits this. Russian state TV admits that the situation when it comes to equipping Russian soldiers is pitiful. Ask Russian military bloggers, they'll admit it as well. Ask any Russian soldier, they'll admit it. Of course, Shoigu, the Russian Minister of Defense, won't admit it because it's embarrassing, but that's the state of affairs. So how are you going to convince a Russian to go to Ukraine, spend money on body armor, spend money on tampons instead of medical gauze because they've run out of the proper medical equipment, and everybody's price gouging them because there's no unity in Russia on this war? You're being price gouged for the military equipment. They're getting like airsoft gear. How are you going to convince somebody to go fight and most likely die in a war where they're going to have piss poor equipment, a rusty AK, old like T-62 mid-Cold War tanks, in this war of aggression where you get nothing out of it? And most likely the large amount of money the Russian government has promised to pay you, the payments aren't even coming in. The checks aren't clearing. How are you going to convince somebody to go fight and die under those conditions? Especially when so many coffins have already come home. Well, you need to make the incarnate of evil, the Nazi, gay, Jewish, transgender enemy that is here to eliminate you and make you gay. If you're not gay, they will never stop. They will not stop capturing villages until every Russian man is sucking cock. Now, that's my personal quest in life, but that is not the quest of the Ukrainian people, or the specific war. Okay, I represent global homo, not them. Thank you very much. But this is the type of propaganda the Russian government has to pump out in order to whip anybody into a patriotic fervor to go die in Ukraine. I can't believe there are some people right now fighting and dying in Ukraine because they're scared of the LGBT transgender Nazis. Fantastic.